My name is Arvinder Ginda. Some people know me as Vinny Ginda, but I do enjoy going back to my preferred name or given name, Arvinder, which I haven't been able to use for about the last 21 years or so, meaning that I just retired from the FBI about 3 or 4 months ago. I get a chance to teach here as an adjunct faculty, and I'm also a student here. So I've got some fellow teachers here, professors that are my professors, so welcome. And they get a chance to see me, and I've got some students here as well, and they're supposed to do this as part of their assignments as well, so it's kind of fun to see everybody. But for the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about two characters, Esther and Moses. And they are two of the most incredible individuals in the Bible. And 25 minutes doesn't do justice on what they've done, their accomplishments, and how powerful and incredible these two individuals are. So I'm only going to cover a very small piece of that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of add something different to it. What I'm going to add to it is for the last 21 years in the FBI and about another 10 years in local law enforcement, one of the key questions I would often ask myself is the individual that I was going to either interview or interrogate, what is their ability to maintain and build relationships? Before I knew it, I was actually conducting an emotional intelligence assessment on these individuals and a behavioral assessment. So this picture here is one of my deployments, and there's two little animals at the bottom there, Ruffy and Brown Bear. And someday in the future, you'll get a chance to read more about them. If not, I'll get a chance to share a little bit more about them as well. And this was, as I said, my first deployment to Iraq. And what I'm going to share with you, as I said, is about Moses and Esther. And I'll do a very quick and short behavioral assessment and an emotional intelligence analysis as well. And what I'm going to do is kind of build a picture. I'm going to share with you what the context of their story is and how it fits in. It's something, as I said, I did with interviews and interrogations, but more importantly, one of my other primary responsibilities within the FBI was hostage negotiations. And I spent quite a bit of time overseas. And the key to this is being able to humanize these individuals. So in 2021, I started going through some difficult times with my physical health and didn't know how long my profession was going to continue being in the Bureau. And I felt driven to write a book. And the first book that I wrote was this book titled Chosen and Flawed. And what I wanted to do was essentially talk about these individuals and analyze people in the Old Testament from a perspective that they're humans. They're people, just like you and I. Times might have changed, but the reality is people are consistently the same. They were broken, they were flawed in many ways, much like what we are today. So if we get into it, to add context, the first one we'll talk about is Esther. The time period we're going to talk about is about 474 BC. And this period is involving Esther and also a particular king named King Xerxes. King Xerxes has one of the largest kingdoms from India all the way to North Africa. And what ended up happening was that he was on a quest to find a new bride, and Esther was selected by his advisors to be brought into the palace and to potentially go through this evaluation. Would she be a good fit, a good queen for the king? What they didn't take into consideration is that she was Jewish. And she was in a palace that obviously was not. And Xerxes was not in any form or fashion who followed God. He was an idol worshiper. And so one day, this individual by the name of Haman, who was the second in command for King Xerxes, he's walking through the city, and as he's walking, people bow down to him. And unfortunately, one particular individual did not bow down to him, and that individual was Mordecai, which happened to be Esther's uncle. That one simple moment of offense, one simple moment where he felt offended that this Jewish slave, which was Mordecai, would not bow down to him, made him so frustrated and angry that he went to the king and said, you know what? These Jews here, they've become a nuisance to our society. I think we need to eliminate them all. Think about this. One act by a person who felt offended and he wanted to wipe out an entire people. And Mordecai finds out about this. And by this time, Esther was already in the palace. So Mordecai has to get in touch with Esther. And the fascinating thing is, Esther in my book is chapter 17. And I wrote her perspective from an undercover agent. And in fact, the title of the particular chapter is Esther, an undercover agent for God. And Mordecai happened to be her handler. And if you think about this in the context of what it means, we have an individual who needs to pass information to a person on the inside, working and present, and Esther receives the information, and Mordecai says, Esther, you got to step up. You got to do something. And by the way, I know I'm not going to be able to go through every one of these Bible references here. Please feel free to take pictures. Please feel free to jot these down for your references, and you're more than welcome to, so that I can kind of go through the story as well. So when Mordecai approaches her, he says to her, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. In other words, if you don't do something, we're going to be annihilated. So what does she do? She says, but who am I? I'm only but one person. I'm going to need some help. And so she asks Mordecai, deliver the message to the other Jews. Deliver the message to everybody else and have them fast for 3 days and to worship God. And she too started fasting. So as she begins to fast, and finally on the third day, she puts on all of her royal garb. Now keep in mind, as I said, this is a young Jewish woman who is now inside of a palace that nobody knows what her heritage is and what her background is. And in those times, if you were to approach the king without being called, and the king didn't accept you, you would automatically be killed. So on the third day, Esther puts on her robes, and as she stood in the inner court of the king's palace, opposite the king's hall, the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace, opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she found favor in his sight. So think about this for a moment. Here she is, pacing back and forth, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be called. And if she's not acknowledged or called, she could be killed. I've been in many operations where emotionality is pretty high, intensity. You have to be able to learn how to control your fear, your angst, everything that a person goes through. And I imagined her like an undercover agent who's getting ready to go into an operation to be able to come up and implement a strategy and a story that meant saving her entire people. And she's standing there. She had to control that entire emotionality. She had to be able to put those fears aside and rely on God. And oftentimes we ask ourselves these questions that, where are you hiding a part of who you are? Where have you mistaken silence from God for absence of God? What difficult conversation are you avoiding because it feels too costly? Oftentimes we hide our identity because we think, I don't fit in here. This is not where I belong. I can tell you, being born a Hindu in a village in north part of India, coming to the States at a young age, not having spoken a single word of English, going to school here in Yuba City area, and then at the age of 16, converting to Christianity. There were times that I wasn't accepted by my friends within the Indian community, nor at times being accepted by my friends within the Caucasian community. Where do I fit in? Job after job, career after career. Here I am at my age, retired, and I've had to take on a new identity again. For 30 years, I had this identity where I was carrying a badge, carrying a gun, and God, where do I fit in now? Until right on the other side of the freeway, here's this university, and I get a chance to teach here. And I was invited by Pete and a few others and asked if I would be interested in coming out and teaching. I thought, well, it's maybe time for me to go to school as well. All these new identities take shape. But for a lot of you, showing up to this university, showing up this morning, wasn't an easy task for you. but you showed up. And so what Esther teaches us is that even when God seems silent, he is still strategically present. Because when we look at what she represents, there's only 2 books in the Bible where God is never mentioned. Only 2 books. God is mentioned in every single book. One of those is Songs of Solomon and Esther. Just because God isn't mentioned doesn't mean God isn't present through the entire story. We look at her story and we go, wow, beautiful woman, very intelligent, very capable. She showed perseverance, resilience. And oftentimes in our own society and culture, how often do we diminish women and diminish people because of the way they may look, or maybe we're intimidated by their intelligence, maybe we're intimidated by their resilience. And Esther here proves to be one of those individuals. She's got an incredible story, stories that you could write Hollywood movies and stories and everything else about. But how often do we learn about her? Very rarely. And it's important because just as her identity, people often look at her and say, she was hiding her identity. I look at her and said, God created the identity she needed in order to save her people. Otherwise, all the Jews would have been killed because the creed had already been signed. And basically, she was able to make a request to the king. And through that request and through that impressive plan that she developed, because the king even asked her, welcome, Esther, what do you want? I'll give you half the palace if you want. You can ask for anything. She doesn't ask for it right away. She says, all I want is a simple dinner with Haman and you. And then she sets her plan in place and allows King Xerxes to come to the same conclusion that everybody else did. And unfortunately, Haman and his family paid the consequence for it. And she was able to save an entire nation. Now we look at somebody else, Moses. Most everybody knows who Moses is. You can learn so much about Moses and some of the lessons he has. Leadership, self-confidence or lack thereof, you name it, you can learn everything. And same thing with Esther, her leadership style, what she brought to the table, her emotionality. And then we look at Moses. Moses was another incredible individual. As most of you guys know his story, he ends up being picked up, or at least at a young age, having to grow up in the palace. And within that, he lives there for 40 years. And for those 40 years, he knew that he didn't fit in because he was a Hebrew, being brought up as an Egyptian. He looked around and said, for some reason, I don't fit in here. Something doesn't work for me. And he looked around and said, there's this individual that's beating a guy who's driving the slaves, and he sees this one day and says, why is this guy beating one of my own brothers? And what does he do? He follows this individual. And my apologies, but I think a few of the slides might be missing on here. So it's okay. I'll still make it through here. So the slide I had up there was in Exodus, I believe 2, 10, and 11. Moses sees this injustice being forced upon this Hebrew. And what does he do? He follows the slave driver. He follows him and waits until everybody's gone. He looks around and says, nobody's here. And then he kills the slave driver. He kills an Egyptian. And he buries the body. He commits murder. And we look at this and go, wait a minute, a man who committed murder, what does he do next? He runs and hides. And he hides into the same very desert where he ends up 40 years later. Most people don't realize this, but Moses wasn't called to serve God at the tender age of 20, 30, 40, 50. He was called at the age of 80. And when he was called that first time at that burning bush, what was his response? God, I can't do this. I've got a speech impediment. It's okay, Moses. I'll send your brother Aaron with you. But God, I don't know if I'm the right person. It's okay. Just tell him who I am. I'm with you. You'll never be alone. What an incredible, incredible amount of confidence to think that Moses could have made a very simple request. You know, God, I can't speak very well, but why don't you help me be more eloquent? Okay, but he didn't ask for that. Instead, he made excuses. But keep this in mind that he spent the next 40 years in the desert. He went from being a royal, a prince in the palace, to being a shepherd. A question was posed to me not too long ago. How come Moses didn't get punished for killing somebody? Are you kidding me? 40 years? Hard labor? Murder in the second degree, sometimes it's 25 to life. He got his punishment. But that 40 years also meant that he had to strip his identity of who he was. Now, he was in the palace. He was brought up to read, write, to be an incredible military soldier, and to learn strategic kind of movement and survival. So what he learned in the first 40 years, he had to use in the second 40 years of his life. And when he had shed his identity and he was ready, that's when God called him. The distance, by the way, between Cairo and Jerusalem, it's about 300 miles. And if you look at Deuteronomy 1:2, during Moses' time, the journey should have only taken them 11 days. Instead, they wandered the desert for 40 years because not only did Moses with God's help, bring the Israelites out of Egypt, but God recognized that those Israelites also had to shed their identity. And the people that were going to enter into Jerusalem were going to be his people. And so, as we follow his story, oh man, a couple of them are not in here. So, Moses makes two major mistakes. The first time, his people are thirsty and said, Moses, we want some water. And Moses gets frustrated. So Moses goes to God and says, God, what am I to do? These people are angry. They're hurting. Help me. God says, all right, Moses, I'm going to go stand on a rock. And the rock that I stand on, I want you to strike it with your staff, and water will come from it. So Moses goes out there, calls all the people, says, you guys want water? Here you go. Strikes the rock. But look at that image. God standing on top of a rock. And the second time, same situation in Numbers, I believe 20, 10 through 12. People come to him and says, Moses, we're thirsty. We need some water. This is several decades later, or several years later. So Moses once again goes to God and says, God, I need help. This time, God does something. He says, Moses, I want you to take your brother Aaron with you and go talk to the rock, and water will come from it. Remember that first image of striking, and the second image, talking. When I did the Moses assessment or evaluation, I thought this act of striking the rock, what meaning does it have? Because the second time he struck the rock when he was supposed to talk to it, it's a major offense, and he doesn't make it to the promised land. Why is that? And I realized the rock, what does it represent? Life-giving water. It represented Jesus. It represented Jesus who was going to be coming into the picture quite some time later. So when God stood on top of that rock and Moses strikes it, think of how often Jesus was struck for all the sins and all the things that we have done, all of our offenses. But the second time God says, hey, talk to the rock. Because God knew that's my son. And instead, Moses gets out there and says, all you rebels, gather up. You want water? I'll give you water. Because now, another part of him comes out. Anger, frustration, instead of patience and love that God had prepared him for. And he said, we will give you water, meaning possibly that Aaron was standing next to him. He strikes the rock, no water. And I bet you people kind of were like, whoa, what's going on? So what does he do? He strikes it again. And water flowed. And when they come back, God has a conversation with them. Moses, what did you do? I asked you to talk to the rock, and you instead struck it. And Aaron, you were supposed to stop him. You didn't. What does he do? God takes Aaron first. And God said, because of your offense, you will never enter the promised land. And so God takes Aaron first, and God tells Moses, okay, get all your affairs in order. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to read just the last about a page and a half out of this book. Once the formalities were concluded, Moses ascended Mount Nebo, where God showed him the promised land. Step back into that specific moment when Moses was standing atop Mount Nebo, and once again talking to God. Moses knew that moment was different from all the other times he and God had interacted. God must have spoken to him in that peaceful, loving way to say, Moses, you've done a good job, and I know you're tired, and you need to know something. God showed Moses the entire land and valley and the land of milk and honey, and Moses looked at it in awe. The fact that reference is made to Moses' health and vitality, and specifically his eyesight, leads me to believe that God may have given Moses a vision, allowing him to see into the future, to see his people living in the land and thriving. After showing Moses that great vision, it must have been so hard for God to tell Moses that he would not be able to enter the promised land. And Moses must have been devastated. But at the same time, perhaps he sensed a supernatural peace. God himself, the God of his father, was standing next to him to deliver the message that he would not experience the fulfillment of the promise. He had done all the hard work, but he would not be there to see it through. As a son may talk to his father after learning the consequences of his disobedience, would Moses have tried to justify his actions to God or to ask for just one more chance? Just as a father feels the pain of having to discipline his child after a wrongdoing, God too must have felt sad for his son, knowing that Moses had truly worked hard and did a multitude of difficult tasks. Suffering greatly throughout his life, especially in the stress of leading a nation of grumblers. As much as it must have pained God to see one of his children suffering in his presence, God also knew that he could not leave Moses in that moment of despair. It was time for him to come home and to finally get some much-needed rest. As Moses sat down with his back to the rock, his back to the chosen land, a land he would never be able to walk in, he took his last breath. God carried him off to bury him in an act of great compassion and unconditional love. Perhaps concerned with the possibility that the Israelites would treat Moses' burial place as a holy place, he buried him in secret. Only God knows where one of his chosen sons has his final resting place. It's a poetic and perfect ending to the life lived by Moses, who was truly carried by God. However, you should know and trust that God will use your pain and suffering to lay a foundation in you so that you too can become resilient and powerful individual. In your suffering, you may feel the depths of anguish and begin to see all of your flaws. That's not a bad thing, because remember, God knows that we will never be perfect. We have our flaws and we have our scars from the times we've suffered. Just know that God can and will use your flaws to ensure you are still chosen for his plan. The pain we suffer, whether physical or emotional, will never be wasted. Rather, it will lay a foundation for a better future. Just stay the course. God is faithful. I share this with you because we look at this and Moses reminds us that even when our flaws carry a consequence, they do not cancel God's love. And when we look at this, times may have changed, but people don't. And we still wonder whether God can still use us. And the answer is yes. Not because we are flawed, but because God is faithful. So, as I leave you with a few of these, and my apologies, they seem to have jumped out of order here. But these are some of the correlation or the how they're connected. Both wrestled with their identity, both lived in tension, both doubted their readiness, both were placed in difficult assignments, and both were flawed. But yet, both were still chosen. So, when we look at any of these and what's transpired in their lives, they're not that much different from us. They all have the same fears, angst, discouragements, and even identity issues. And I thank you for your time. And if you have any questions or there's individuals that you would like to see an emotional intelligence or behavioral analysis conducted on, please reach out. I'd love to be able to introduce some of these characters to you. Jerome, thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Arvinder. Yeah, we appreciate you. Do you guys mind standing for me? And I would love to pray for Professor Arvinder. And if you guys don't mind just extending your hand and joining me, that would be amazing. So, Father God, we thank you so much for Vinny, God. We thank you for the fact that you have given him such a beautiful message through his book, Lord, and he got to share it with us today. We thank you, Lord, that even though we're broken and we're flawed, you still choose us. And what a beautiful revelation that is. We thank you for that gift, and we just pray this morning, God, that you would just be with us, that you would bless us, that your face would shine upon us as we go about our day. And we just pray these things in the mighty and powerful name of Jesus. Amen.